within a couple of weeks, I'd be surprised if Storm Shadow or Scalp were not being used against Russian air bases, say 200 to 300 miles inside Russia. I'm sure that Putin's comments in the last 24 hours won't make any difference to the decisions that will be taken this afternoon in the Oval Office. This was absolutely expected, given that we've been talking about the possibility of longer range weapons being authorized for Ukraine's use for a couple of weeks now. Putin was always going to make a strong statement when he thought that we might be on the verge of confirming a decision. It's no surprise that Britain and France have taken the view that Ukraine ought to be allowed to use their Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, the same missile, basically, it's a cruise missile, that they ought to be able to use them against airfields in Russia, the basis from which Russia is launching so many destructive attacks against Ukrainian civilians as well as along the front lines. So that's no surprise. And the idea that they're going to Washington in order to get the sign off from Biden for this seems to be on the agenda. So it was inevitable that Putin would say something, and that's a very carefully choreographed statement. I noticed that Putin made it look as if he was just sort of stopped in the middle of walking somewhere in order to say this, if it was a spontaneous statement. But that was all very carefully choreographed and absolutely expected. And he always does this. I mean, he always establishes that there's a red line here, that we can't accept this. And it's nonsense. I mean, it's nonsense because he can't enforce it anyway. It's nonsense because he's doing his worst as things stand against Ukraine. He's doing his worst against Western societies. And it's nonsense in the sense that he's using North Korean supplied missiles against Ukraine. He's now using Iranian supplied missiles against Ukraine. He's using Russian missiles full of Chinese components against Ukraine. And somehow he thinks that's okay. But Western missiles that Ukraine uses against him is not okay. I mean, it's nonsense. The idea is that we are prepared to give Ukraine the tools to do the job. Just as that's exactly what Winston Churchill said during the Second World War. He said to the Americans, "Give us the tools, and we will do the job." And there's a sort of a resonance of that in the way the West is reacting to this unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And in a way, the Biden administration is in an interesting situation now because, I mean, Joe Biden is not going to run for president. He wants to leave a legacy of a strong response in favor of Ukraine. Whatever happens in the November elections, they want to bake in as far as possible American support for Ukraine. And so I think, between now and the elections, Biden is likely to be more assertive, more liberal about thinking of what they can do for Ukraine than he was before, because he wants his legacy to be that the Democrats stood up for Ukraine and will continue to stand up for Ukraine if Kamala Harris wins the election. And equally, Britain is getting a certain amount of dangerous kudos out of this. I mean, Britain is making a big effort to lead the European nations to show that that we're not frightened of Russia. We will do what we think is right to do. The thing is, our physical ability to help is a bit limited. There's all sorts of ways we can help, and we do, with training, with some intelligence, with some special force operations, it is said, and with certain weapons, although we don't have very many weapons to offer, but we do what we can. And in a way, Britain is gaining some credit with the United States, which partly makes up for the damage that Brexit has done to our image in the United States. I mean, apart from Donald Trump himself, pretty well every serious analyst in the States thought that Brexit was a mistake in foreign policy terms because it took us out of a European forum. It made it more difficult for the Americans to think that we were useful. I mean, we're far less useful outside Europe than we were in Europe. So this sort of initiative shows that we can work hard to retrieve some of the ground we lost. And there is a sense in which I think the Starmer administration wants to show that, A, we've got a better relationship with our European partners. B, we are tough-minded. Starmer is showing he's a tough-minded man, both on domestic policy, on industrial policy, and now on foreign and security policy. So there is some benefits here, both for a Biden administration that is trying to lay a legacy and a Starmer administration that's trying to create an image and a legacy. People do get worried, and that's absolutely understandable. And believe me, they really get worried in Germany. I mean, the Germans are really, both public opinion and political parties are really frightened. And they would tend to say, look, it's all right for you Brits, you're further away. You can detach yourselves. You do detach yourselves. And I understand that asymmetry. But the fact is that when this invasion took place in February 2022, I would have said that the chances of a general European war before this invasion were not zero, but they were, I don't know, 5%. Let's guess 5%, 10%. Now, 2.5 years into the war, they're higher. They're certainly higher. But I would say, well, it's a 20% chance, a 25% chance that this could escalate into general European war. But we're still a long way away from it, because the Russians know if they got into a general European war, they would lose. Simple as that. They would lose militarily. They would lose in a big way, unless somehow they could run a European war by fighting first one, then another, then another, then another, and still they'd be on their knees by the time they'd fought 4 of us or 5 of us. And if they are involved in a war against NATO as a whole, they lose, and they lose very quickly. Now, that said, there'll be an enormous amount of destruction before that comes about. So we shouldn't be sanguine about that. And we've always got to be aware, as you imply, that there's a possibility of miscalculation. Wars do start with miscalculation, and we are very careful about. We in the West are very careful about that. Everyone worries about nuclear weapons. I mean, in the West, from the very beginning of this war, we stood down all of our nuclear exercises. We stopped doing nuclear things so as not to be misunderstood. The Russians, by contrast, ramped up all of their nuclear exercises. They played games with their nuclear exercises to try and frighten us. They are the only ones who talk about nuclear war. We never talk about it. We don't do anything about it. We are quietly careful in everything we do in nuclear terms, and we're far more careful than Russia is about conventional escalation, far more careful. The Russians are reckless. And the question about that recklessness is, well, do you actually let yourself be intimidated by it and back off? It's like the playground bully, give in to him, the playground bully, and hope he goes away. Well, he will until tomorrow and then the day after. Or do you actually establish the fact that you're not going to be bullied, that you're carefully and calculatedly determined? And that's what the West is trying to do. It's trying to say, look, we're not reckless. We understand the dangers, but we're not going to let you get away with this reckless bullying that you seem to think will work. And the more Putin goes in for these bullying tactics, the weaker he seems to be to other politicians, maybe not to the public. I understand why the public worry. And if I wasn't in this business, I would worry as well. But I think I know enough about what's going on. And I think I have enough of a grip on policy making in the Western world and in other parts, and policy making as well in Russia and the Allied states, to understand that there is a sort of an asymmetry here of recklessness. And our job is not to be reckless, but to be determined. I mean, the Russians assume that if they can carry this on for long enough, if they can make this whole process last, we will just give up on it. I mean, the Russians are prepared to take huge losses on the ground in Ukraine, to lose the effect on their economy, to lose their own demographics. They're prepared to trade in losses in this war in favor of time, just to keep it going, because they think that we will give up. Now, I worry that might turn out to be right. Maybe we will. I certainly hope we don't. And so far, we haven't. But we've got to be clear that if we give up, then we're playing to exactly what he wants. He will take any amount of loss if he can keep this going next year, the year after that, and the year after that. So we have to be clear that we will not just go away, that we mean what we say. Yeah, I mean, in real terms, it's neither here nor there, because these people left a while ago, and so the embassy's functions will contract. It's very important that embassies do stay open, at least to keep a line open, even if it's only an ambassador or an acting ambassador or a consular office. It's very important that there is some connection. But obviously, what the embassy can do with fewer staff is that they do less, or it takes them longer to do the usual stuff that they do. So it reduces the power of the embassy. It doesn't make a lot of difference in any other way. And what we're talking about, the withdrawal of accreditation, means that those people who left now can't go back to Russia. Well, fine, okay. Doesn't make any difference. And then the Russians come up with reasons, because they say that you engaged in espionage. Why? Because you spoke to somebody who was known to have views which are critical of the government. This somebody hasn't been arrested. This somebody is a Russian citizen, and you had the temerity to speak to a Russian citizen. You had the temerity to talk to an organization that we don't like. Well, if that's espionage, then so be it. But that's the point. It makes Russia look weak, that they've got to come up with these absurd rationales in order to create a diplomatic maneuver which is not to throw these people out, just to say, well, you can't come back. Well, okay, fine. It just, I'm not going to get very excited about that. And I don't think the Foreign Office will either. I mean, at some point in the future, we will build up our staff again, as and when it's possible, and expand the things that embassies need to do. But it's not, we're not in good. Don't have a good relationship with Russia. We're not likely to have for the next few years. So it's logical that the function of just keeping one line of communication open, one official diplomatic line of communication, that as long as that's there, then it doesn't really matter that the rest goes. It's a shame, but that's the way it is. No, that's right. It's diplomatic, normal work. And I mean, Russian diplomats in Britain spend long hours talking to people that they want to speak to in Britain, and they're free to do so. We don't worry about that. It's purely manipulated. I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised that the story is running as hot as it is today, because I bet it's not running this hot inside the Foreign Office. I mean, they were waiting for this. They really don't mind. And the other thing I think to say, which is kind of important, is a lot of people get worried. They say, why aren't we talking to the Russians? Why aren't we discussing? We're talking to the Russians all the time. Why aren't we discussing peace? We're discussing it all the time, not usually in formal diplomatic channels, not in ways that go into the newspapers. But believe me, individuals talk to other individuals, organizations talk to other organizations via third parties. There is a constant day-to-day dialogue going on between people in Russia, people in Belarus, people in Germany, people in Britain about how can we get out of this? How can we find a way through which stops this awful suffering, stops the war, puts Russia back into behaving like a normal country, whatever. There's constant discussion going on. It's not that there's no discussion; it's the level of discussion which changes, the officialness of it. But believe me, there's a great deal of it going on. I would say, within a couple of weeks, I'd be surprised if Storm Shadow or Scalp were not being used against Russian air bases, say 200 to 300 miles inside Russia. That would be my expectation. May be wrong. I'm wrong about lots of things, but since you put me on the spot, that's what I think.